Good afternoon from Vienna and welcome to this edition of the FIW-Trade Talks. The FIW-Trade Talks receive generous financial support from the Austrian Ministry of Labor and the Economy, and we as usual are very grateful for this support. My name is Harald Oberhofer and I'm today's host. As usual, I think for most of you who are familiar with our housekeeping rules, I still remind you on how this works before introducing our today's speaker. So we're going to have an input from our distinguished speaker that lasts for about 15 to 20 minutes. And afterwards, we will have another around 40 minutes for discussion. And you can also participate in the discussion by posting your questions or comments in the Q&A section here in the Zoom call. After the seminar, you will receive a short feedback questionnaire, and we would be happy if you could just give us feedback on today's FIW-Trade Talks, but the series in general. Having said that, I would now like to move to today's topic, and I'm really delighted, and it's my pleasure to welcome Iana Dreyer as our speaker of today. Iana will give a talk on how great power trade policy is reshaping globalization. Obviously, a very, very topical topic, so I think we will have a lot to discuss in this next hour. Iana is founder and editor of Borderlex, one of the leading European publications on trade policy. And maybe Iana will talk a little bit more on Borderlex in her input, or she will also be happy to take questions on that. So I will not talk too much on Borderlex right now. Iana has deep international trade policy expertise spanning over 15 years now. Before launching Borderlex, Iana worked as a policy analyst in think tanks with a focus on international trade and also international energy policy, another very important topic, obviously, for our debates. To give some examples, Iana has worked with the European Center for International Political Economy, the Institute Montaigne, and the EU Institute for Security Studies. She has also worked for Financial Times and is trained in journalism, as I have learned. Iana obtained postgraduate degrees both from the London School of Economics as well as Sciences Po in Paris. And I also learned she's commuting a lot. She's spending her working time between Brussels, Paris, and London. Having said that, I would now like to hand over to you, Iana. It's really my great pleasure having you in this trade talk, and I'm very much looking forward to your input.
Well, thank you very much, Harald, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here with you and to be sharing some thoughts. I will try and share my slides if you don't mind. I'm always trying to do several things at the same time, which is never good. There we go. Share up. Very good. And then I'll go full screen. Okay.
Perfect.
This is a very challenging and very big topic, obviously, and this will not give all answers. I will try to explain a little bit where I'm coming from here. Borderlex.net is a mix of journalism and analysis, which we offer to professional subscribers, and I think probably your ministry or some of your ministries are definitely signed up to Borderlex. So we try to keep abreast of trade policy, doing journalism and trying to keep, regulatory monitoring, but also commentary and analysis. And that's a little bit where I'm coming from, pointing to some of the great power dynamics that are shaping trade and globalization. Obviously, because of Borderlex focus, we are in Europe. It's very EU focused in our content. I don't go into detail in China, but that's a little bit where we are. And I'll comment, coming from a perspective, a long time observer. I've been watching this game for a long time, finding it always astonishing how much things evolve and change to compare to 10, 15 years ago. But I think when you approached me, it was more a question about fragmentation, the global economy, what is happening. And I was telling you, well, I can't actually give you precise numbers. I'm not an economist in that sense, but I can probably give you more of the politics that shape this. And I think if we can nail it somewhere, what is it that is happening, or that has happened, that is now changing the system in which we're working globally. It's clearly the end of the unipolar world order. I think we trade people tend to forget, especially people in our generation. We were born into this unipolar world that looked peaceful. I was a teenager when the World Trade Organization was founded. It was a happy moment. It was created with full support of the United States, with leadership of the United States. A time of optimism, but we must also remember that the 90s were historically a rather unique moment, and international geopolitical systems never stay stable over time. They always evolve. Some of it, of what's happening now, is partly the success due to the success of the WTO, which China acceded to in 2001. 13 years later, China overtook the United States as the largest global economy in PPP and purchasing parity terms, according to the IMF. So this creates a new system, no longer polar, it's bipolar, multipolar, whatever you call it. And then we had a range of other policy shifts coming, one of them due to the climate crisis, which gets mixed up in the geopolitics, and domestic developments in the United States as well, that lead to a retreat from a commitment to free or multilateral or non-discriminatory trade. So here on these slides, you have a little chronology. It's a bit, I tried to put a few key milestones in there. For us in the trade policy world, I think the most symbolic, not symbolic, but the one that goes to the heart of the matter is the demise of the appellate body in the World Trade Organization. It's the appellate body used to be the jewel in the crown in the WTO, seen as the success of judicial and peaceful settlement of trade disputes, which could help trade to move forward, even if the big powers, which are main users of the dispute settlement system, were able to then adjudicate their cases. But for a range of reasons, the United States decided it was a loser of this system, which is objectively not the case. But it lost a few cases where the domestic politics are not in support. So it blocked the appointment of new members when the old members, the terms were finished. So since December 2019, there is no longer an appellate body. What is, I think, more important is the fact that the Biden administration, which said it was committed to multilateralism, didn't come back. And the Biden administration, although wanting to work with political allies, which the Trump administration did not do, on its trade policy, is basically staying the course on a range of topics. We can get back to it later in the Q&A if we want to talk about EU-US relationship, for example. And then comes, of course, the war in Ukraine. Obviously, as someone who's worked on energy before, I know it all started with Crimea earlier, but it's a strange, huge escalation of this whole conflict with the invasion of Ukraine in March 2022. It's no longer only a Russian issue, it's also the question of China behind it. How far China is backing or not stopping Russia in this issue, which changes the geopolitical game dramatically, generally. Of course, these are issues that are way beyond everyone's pay grade here, but they affect it. They just come into our line. So everything that's been happening here is the policy responses to all this is starting, I think, to show in the data. I haven't seen much, but they're starting to show. For example, the April 2023 World Economic Outlook of the International Monetary Fund, comes out every 6 months, has already found that foreign direct investment flows are increasingly concentrated among countries that are geopolitically aligned. And as economists know, most of trade is actually induced by foreign direct investments. It's it's companies, factories, placing their different investments elsewhere and then trading among themselves or in a system of global value chains. So there is a trend towards reconcentration among, as it happens, geopolitical allies. Probably the geopolitics is not the only game here. Many other factors, purely economic factors, play as well. So technology, globalization, the fact, things like that. But fundamentally, the trend is there. And clearly, I look at Brussels and geopolitics playing. I've also observed American companies, how they have shifted their positions here and there due to the politics. So this is happening one way or the other. How far it will go remains to be seen, and which sectors remains to be seen, but it is starting to be perceptible in the models of the different economies. What is interesting also is what companies themselves say. The EU Chamber of Commerce in China, so it's a representation of most of business associations in Beijing. They released this spring a business confidence survey, which was an astonishing read, I must say, where they really explained how investments from companies are shifting out of China as they are starting to de-risk their exposure to China. In many ways, this doesn't mean they're pulling out of China, but it's more that the next investment, the next factory is no longer necessarily going to go to China. Again, geopolitics plays, pandemic plays, all things. There's a multiplicity of factors, but it is definitely happening. And what is interesting to say as well, that some of them, to the contrary, invest deeper in China, because as China is wanting to go, it also to become a bit more independent from the global trading system. It has a dual circulation strategy, as it calls it, a huge market, and some businesses are investing in China, but by being ready to cut themselves off from the left or to insulate or put firewalls between their different systems, which will mean that there's less trade potentially down the road there with the rest of the world or the West or whatever you call it in this new geopolitics we are in. I think what's also happening is partly a political systems psychological shock and reaction, how justified or not, to the fact that China has actually been able to innovate strongly and had the scale to bring innovations to the market in a way that, upends at 500-year-old monopoly of Western power, innovative leadership. So I think it's a bit of a psychological shock there. But it has done that in the green tech field, being a leader in electrical vehicles. That at a time when the US was innovating too, but doing shale gas, which had other advantages. It also reduced CO2 emissions of the United States away from coal to gas. But still, now it's increasingly clear that we need to go faster and even get rid of gas at some point. So China was there first. That's what we see. Then we have, obviously, within this US-China rivalry, the US wanting to come back to the Paris Agreement after the Trump administration did not want it. But then the condition was, let's not rely on China for this, which means local content requirements, which is a violation of basic multilateral rules, WTO norms, distortion of global markets, etc., affecting not only China, but also allies in Europe and East Asia. The EU is having a comparable reaction to this. It also discovered it lagged behind in the EV revolution. I think, some of our car producers were a bit too comfortable for a long time, selling big cars across the world. EU also turning to industrial policy, battery alliance. It started actually 2017. Now for example, the Net Zero Industry Act. And when it starts subsidizing, the EU ends up also using its trade defense instruments, anti-dumping and anti-subsidies, a little bit as a sort of one of the tools that it uses to subtly or less subtly keep out some competition for the sectors that it is supporting. And we see it, for example, in the latest development, which is the new anti-subsidy investigation into imports of electric vehicles from China, which is obviously a very politicized case here. The EU on the climate front as well has recently started to introduce regulations that are problematic for the system as well. Carbon border adjustment, the deforestation regulation, which conditions basically imports on the way they are produced, process and production methods, which in terms of WTO law is highly questionable. Some people debate how much the appellate body used to favor that. But fundamentally, the WTO rules are supposed to ignore how products are made. And now for the EU, this is becoming the norm. Big question. That depends also the multilateral system, puts it under strain there or not. So that was sort of the mixing of green, geopolitics, and trade. And now we have also the hard geopolitics, war, things like that. I think we had forgotten about it. But obviously, this has become, I mean, this was an issue already under the Obama administration. The US wanting to keep out some Chinese innovative firms, such as providing highly effective internet infrastructure systems like 5G. That started with the Obama administration for reasons that are probably justified. The approach to data privacy, cyber espionage, all these kind of things are real risks. That started on the Obama administration, strengthened under Trump, and is not abating now, especially since the war in Ukraine. So this is coming. The United States has restricted FDI. It has restricted exports, and all this in the high tech sector, which is really, I mean, this is a trend that is a little bit in flux. How far will the US go? But there's a clear trend towards wanting to cut off the high tech sector, the AI, everything, AI technologies, the semiconductors that feed AI, to cut, to put a wall between the US systems and the Chinese systems. So this is coming, and the EU is a bit caught in between. We can get back to that if you want. There's another trend that is there, which is linked to all the above. Again, it's also the focus on securing supply chains. It was linked to the pandemic. Again, just reinforcing this trend of every big power wanting to have control with supply chains and its exports and its imports. We've seen that with export controls during the pandemic. On medical gear, there were semiconductor shortages, etc. And then the Chinese being seen also as using this for political reasons. Okay, so this is a broader context where you see old-fashioned geopolitics, green politics coming in, and more unstable systems emerging due to shocks such as pandemics. What does this mean for the trading system at the moment? I think what we're witnessing is really the fact that the great powers are in a way abandoning the core rules of the system, of the WTO system. So a most favored nation principle, national treatment is, and all the rules such as, you don't look into how a product is produced. You don't discriminate between like products. This is being thrown overboard in many ways. And everyone is doing it. I mean, the US is doing it, the EU as well in some ways, and China. China's industrial policies, the strong subsidization, intellectual property violations, a range of other discrimination in the market. That's very clear. The EU started doing this, started also retreating from some norms of the WTO, for example, when it introduced its data, when the cross-border data flow issue came up in trade agreements, in trade policy, after it introduced the GDPR. There was a big, around 2018, 2019, when the EU was negotiating with Japan, a free trade agreement that was concluded in 2019, came into force 2021. It took the EU a while to decide what kind of approach it would to take to letting data, which is sort of the engine of today's innovative economy, how it would regulate those rules. The EU decided not to just adhere to what is already in the WTO, in the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, where there is an exception if you want to regulate for public health and things like that. And privacy. Data privacy was already in the minds of people in '95, despite what people say. It was quite forward-looking. But there was the usual caveat in the WTO system that any measure must be proportionate, necessary, and does not distort trade. But the EU decided that any measure that is taken on data privacy reasons, regardless, is legitimate. So it has introduced that in its latest free trade agreements. So it is WTO minus on data flows. It's one of those subtle things, but that's how you undermine a system, or maybe you make it evolve when the system does not evolve. It depends on your perspective on this issue. But the EU did this well, and the EU was an early, actually, player in this game of big powers retreating a little bit from some of the rules. Obviously, now with the Green Deal, CBAM, and I already mentioned those. Article 20 is basically the rule. Article 20 is the article that says you are allowed to upend all the rules in this system for to preserve natural resources, for example, for the environment, as long as you don't discriminate. So you do this consistently, etc. The EU says we're using Article 20, which in Brussels doesn't seem to shock anyone, but when you go to Geneva, people are shocked. So you're just finding it okay to invoke an exception. And obviously the most shocking development has been the US approach to national security in the WTO. Obviously, we've all seen that in Europe when the United States introduced tariffs on steel and aluminium, invoking national security exception, which everyone knows not an issue, but that was the exception. That was adjudicated in the WTO, found obviously illegal under the WTO. The United States now in Geneva, there are conversations on reforming the WTO, bringing back the appellate body and the dispute settlement system. But the US says national security, you cannot adjudicate it. They don't want anyone, for them, this is non-justiciable. It is an absolute principle. And they don't want any panel of 3 arbitrators somewhere to tell them what their national security. So again, the exception is the rule. And we must also not forget that since the war, also the G7 and some other friends of the G7 have rescinded the MFN status of Russia. And Russia is a member of the WTO, so perfectly justifiable even under WTO rules. But we have a system where the great powers themselves no longer apply the core rules of the system that they created, which is disturbing. So this means we're drifting. This is a recipe for drifting, unless there is a grand bargain at some point on this issue. Let's not expect that this will happen in Abu Dhabi at the next ministerial conference in February. At the next ministerial WTO, it's not just going to happen like that overnight. So I think this is, the core of the system here is under challenge. How to, in the EU in all this, how to think about it. Obviously, the EU is in commercial terms, it's a global commercial power, thanks to its large unified single market. It is not a military power, it is a fragmented polity. Security goes either via NATO or, in the case of Austria, I don't know how. But yeah, so it makes decision making, where you have something coherent between trade policy and national security. It's more complicated in the EU. It makes the EU also more vulnerable to the different, when there are tensions. The United States can go to one member state and say, you stop exporting your high-tech semiconductor technology to China now, and Brussels has absolutely no say in that. So it becomes very complicated for the EU to be in this state of fragmentation in a time of real, very difficult tensions. The EU's power is mainly noticeable by trading partners through the Brussels effect. I think you, Harald, you've written a little bit on that. What I found funny being in Brussels in recent years, obviously the Brussels effect was never intended, it just happened. And over the last years, you had leaders in Brussels saying, we're gonna use we're gonna regulate and use the Brussels effect. The question is, how far can you push this? Trying to regulate the digital economy when yourself, you're not the biggest innovator in the digital sphere, when it's the US and China on the other hand, when your share of the global population, the global economy is shrinking by the day. And on top of that, you have your political vulnerabilities. How you can't count on that, I would say. So I think that is a little bit the challenge ahead. And I see this increasingly challenging, from a commercial perspective. If it was only about China, one could find a way, I think. But the moment we have a problem with the United States, we don't know how much the United States will remain committed to the European security order, how much it will want to invest into it in future. This is a real question that the Trump administration put sharply, into light. But this question is haunting us again, because again, elections next year in the United States, and we can't be hanging as Europeans from one election to the others. So this is a huge challenge here for the EU generally as a polity, but also its trade policy. And the question is, can it rely on this regulatory power that it has to influence the WTO, to influence its trading partners, etc., etc. So there we are. And then we have also domestic problems. At the moment, we don't have a perfect customs union, for example, because Poland and Hungary and Slovakia are still banning imports from Ukraine unilaterally in violation of EU laws. And I don't see the Commission really being very, tough on these countries. It's trying to build compromises, but it is sort of accepting is really a fundamental violation. The principle, if that continues, because we've seen that in recent years in other policy areas, once one country starts violating Schengen, starts violating this, everyone else starts doing it. So I don't know. If we're violating customs union, single market. It's actually quite dangerous, I think, for the commercial power of the EU as well, and of global influence. So I think that's one point I wanted to make in this conversation. And again, back to data. I mean, again, right from the beginning, even EU policy, but people talk about how hard the US has been. It is clear that foreign direct investment from China into the US has gone down to a trickle. That's everything very controlled. That the EU is a bit softer, doesn't wants to de-risk, not decouple, blah blah. So for the moment, it's a very messy picture, but there are signs already that whatever the EU has done in its industrial policy, in its security-related policy, in its supply chain securing policy, it is already having an effect on Chinese businesses. We had that very recently in a report of an association of Chinese companies represented in the EU, the CCCEU, where they said that Chinese firms operating, especially in the tech sector, already feel the pinch. Basically, they feel excluded from all sorts of markets, obviously from subsidies. Companies don't want to do businesses with them anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So they already are feeling the pinch. So even the EU, in a way, is starting to fragment part of its trade from China. The winners in the short term, it's a lot Southeast Asia, an FTA partner such as Vietnam attracted a lot of investments. We'll see, and probably there will be more to come, given the trend also in trade defense. We've seen the electrical vehicles case, but there might be others coming on solar panels, wind turbines, etc. Unless someone shouts and says, I mean, we want to green, but it's so expensive, we need the Chinese stuff. But for the moment, well, these are the politics. That's where it is going. Yes, I mean, the way forward for the EU, I mean, this is something that policymakers need to sit down on and really think. As I mentioned it already, a lot of trade leverage, but the trend is diminishing. Strained politics, competitiveness challenges. I mean, there are competitive niches in the EU. There are some very high competitive sectors, companies that are networked with especially the US system, but it's not something that permeates the entire economy in a way that it does elsewhere. We have major educational problems across Europe. We're restricting migration where we need talent. We have neglected through all those years of post-crisis austerity, our infrastructure, things like that. So there's the huge investments to be done. There's a need to diversify trade relationships. Obviously, there are agreements under negotiations with big markets such as India, with Mercosur, that we never know if it's ever going to happen, but the size of Mercosur and the tariff cuts that are foreseen in the agreement would really be a boost, especially to industry and the whole arc from northern Italy to the Netherlands, and with Austria and Germany in between, and parts of France as well. So that would certainly help diversify, but we have the politics we have making it difficult. And there's politically a need to invest in the reform of the WTO. The EU is doing as much as it can. It can act alone, so it will also need to find other alternatives. There we are. So it's a lot. I try to make it clear as possible, and I'm there to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Iana, for this very comprehensive tour d'horizon through all the issues we are facing right now in trade policy. And I would totally agree. It's complicated, and you nicely showed how complicated things are right now, actually. So maybe before I start with the first question, just a reminder to the audience, please feel free to participate in our discussion by posting your questions and/or comments in the Q&A section here in the Zoom link. So I took some notes, and maybe I would just first start with a very short run type of question, because I think also I found the data you showed about this business survey in China very interesting. So, and people working on China today see that, well, China is having some issues, right, in internal economic development. And so now we have this additional signs that indeed for kind of in historic manner, FDI is floating out of the country, which is not yet used to be the case. So the question would be: do you believe that all the issues China is facing right now, so FDI is going down, people are pulling out their investments, they have this huge issue with the construction sector, they have the issue of youth unemployment, they have the issue of growth rates are not looking as they wanted them to look. Do you see that there might be any short-run gain from that with respect to maybe a little bit more multilateralism? So, at least in my impression, when the Chinese president met the US president just a couple of days ago, at least in terms of language, it was like, we want to have peace and we want to work together. What is your point on this? Do you think maybe the short-run pressure could help, especially with respect to multilateralism a bit?
I think respect to multilateralism, I mean, China has not been the worst player in the WTO recently on multilateralism. For example, it values very much the dispute settlement system of the WTO. It is participating in the alternative system that was established among, I think there are between 20 and 25 WTO members, the MPIA, sort of an ad hoc appeals mechanism that some set up, including the EU. The EU pushed this. So China is part of this. China is also relatively constructive in some of the negotiations we see, even in fisheries. So it's not the worst offender in that sense. Obviously, it doesn't like to discuss its SOE, its state-owned enterprises and its subsidies. I mean, yeah, it's in a bargaining position there. So I think that must be said first. I think most disruptive is the US attitude at the moment. First thing said. Second, I have also observed that the Chinese have become, for example, also in a bilateral setting with the EU, a bit more emollient on some issues. For example, I think it was one of their cybersecurity laws, where they basically their new rules on data security means that you don't take out any data out of China. Made it a bit difficult for European companies. And I had the impression that ahead of the summit that is going to take place in 7th and 8th December, the Chinese have started easing some of the rules, seeking input of European firms. So there might be some marginal adjustments, some deal making. I do suspect, however, I mean, you have to ask really the China experts, but I've been long enough in this kind of environment to have the impression that, you know, the Chinese will not let loose of their political system. The system has changed under Xi Jinping, and systems tend to want to not lose control. So whatever, they might do something as long as their political system survives this. So I wouldn't expect miracles at the moment, but it's a little bit of pragmatism here and there on the margins, I would say.
Thanks. Yeah, this is, I think, something we still need to observe for the short run, but now maybe move to the broader perspective from a European point of view. And I would like to split this debate into two things. The first one is on EU and its external relationships, so WTO and trading partners outside EU, and then maybe later going back to our internal issues, because I also found them very interesting to talk a bit about this. And I think one of my first questions on the external relationship is also related to a question from the chat that Manfred Jacqueline he also thanks you a lot for this very insightful talk first, and then he brings in a question and maybe combine both of them. So my point of view would be, you nicely mentioned that now basically people or governments are taking Article 20 or even Article 21 just as how they like, because actually they all think multilateralism is dead. And then the question is why multilateralism is dead. This is related to Manfred's question, and so he asks that there are those that argue that WTO times is over for good because its function relied on the US playing the benevolent hegemon, which it no longer can be or no longer wants to be. What does that mean for the global trade system, and what can the EU as a self-declared principal defender of multilateral system do? This is his question, and maybe I just added another note on this, because you were talking about Article 20 and Article 21, but maybe if you go a bit back in history, my impression at least is that Article 24 was as important as well, because we have been seeing that multilateralism basically stopped working after the formation of WTO, and so everybody moved for Article 24 and had free trade agreements. So we even deviated from the multilateral system when we imposed it, actually. Yeah. And so the question is, in general, what is the future for the WTO, and what should we in Europe do, given what we see in terms of behavior of the US, and also what you already mentioned on China with subsidies and state aid and all of those things?
Yeah. I don't think the WTO is completely dead in that sense. I mean, it looks that we will have a minimum deal on fishery subsidies, the last multilateral agreement on subsidies. I mean, obviously, it's a very weak deal that prohibits subsidies on activities that are prohibited anyway, but that's that's a minimum set of rules. It is still a place where people, I think, when you look at the boring committee work that is taken there is a lot of discussion nonetheless, and a lot of trade frictions that are being averted because a lot of that is being discussed in committee in advance. And this is one of the invisible types of work that the WTO continues to do in many areas. It's mostly more boring and doesn't hit the headlines, but I think that is still important. The big question as well is, I mean, there has been a trend towards minilateralism or plurilateralism, like the EU seeking this alternative appeals mechanism, MPIA. Obviously, right now, expansion is a bit of on hold because actually the big powers, including the US, they're talking again about WTO. We will see. They committed to deliver something in 2024. Probably not happen in 2024. It depends if how the US elections go up. But, you know, there is a conversation going on, and these conversations are never entirely useless. If it's 5 years later, something happens. I think that must be taken into account. There have been other agreements that were signed, concluded, and where actually I did mention the other spoilers in the system, like countries such as India, which is also less of a trading power, but big power, definitely nuclear power, and increasing their trading power. There's also playing a bit of a spoiler game in the WTO by blocking the conclusion of plurilateral agreements. There is an agreement that was concluded this year on investment facilitation for development, which is a soft agreement, no hard new rules, but sets some basic standards, telling, you know, a bureaucracy should have these basic rules of engagement with foreign investors to help facilitate trade, investments, FDI, which is something that developing countries have cared a lot about. More than 100 WTO members, more than 2/3 of the membership is actually part of this. And people expect this deal to happen one way or the other, even if India is playing a little bit spoiler game trying to block it. It's the same for the services domestic regulation. There was a similar agreement, a bit smaller, where India is making problems with certifying the annexes that some countries agreed to add. But again, this is not a process that it can hold forever. So I mean, it is worth investing. into it, but it will be the minimum floor of global rules that everyone from a poor African state to the rich Scandinavian country can agree to. Why not? I mean, you need that. This brings me to the FTA question. As academics, one knows this conversation is it building blocks or stumbling blocks towards the WTO, Article 21. I find the EU has not been the worst offender in terms of, I mean, but then we need to adjudicate that. There was never an adjudication. And what can panelists say anyway on these very complex issues? I mean, the condition for regional trade agreements to be seen as compatible with the WTO is that they basically cover all trade, define what it is. But obviously the EU has trade agreements, especially the latest one, have been very thorough, not complete, but quite thorough in the liberalization of tariffs. They go relatively far in terms of services and public procurement. So this has not been the worst problem, I would say. The problem is also what is in the FTAs themselves. Most of the time, most advanced country agreements actually refer to WTO rules. The WTO is a sort of the basic reference framework and build on it. There are exceptions, as I said, sort of the WTO minus provisions and data and things like that, but fundamentally that's been the case. And that's how WTO rules somehow seem to survive one way or the other. The African Continental Free Trade, which is not my expertise, but what I've heard is that they inspire themselves a lot also from the WTO rule system. They're trying to establish a dispute settlement system that is inspired by the WTO. So the WTO lives on under other forms, maybe.
Yeah.
But you see, I mean, it's going to be an interesting development the next.
Yeah, sounds very interesting to me. So I haven't thought about this way about WTO, but I would agree. And also your examples are nice in that way, telling us, well, there may be still room for WTO, but maybe not for the great powers in a big respect, and also not for strategic parts of the economy or something like that. So climate change related and national security related, it seems to be the case. I have now two very, in my point of view, very interesting additional questions, also somehow related to the external and comparative and also competitive aspect of Europe and Austria. I would like to start with Martin Rees' question first. This is somehow related to what we briefly discussed before we had the official start of the trade talk. It's about Austria, and he's saying Austria does seem to have rather limited popular support in dealing with some of the challenges ahead. You mentioned Austria is, by virtue of its long-standing commitment to neutrality, not best placed to help in hard security matters. Austria does not have too much backing from its population on new free trade agreements or diversification of trading partners. Do you have any policy recommendations for Austria? What is an Austrian way forward inside the EU way forward? That's an excellent question.
It is very difficult, really. I mean, as I said, I sit in France. Good luck. So it is extremely difficult. Why there's less support for free trade? I think that's something that everyone needs to grapple with. Obviously, that's something that's been ignored. I think more by some more politicians and policymakers and actually economists is the fact that when you liberalize trade, you globalize all one way or the other. There, at least in the short term, losers with winners and losers, and it's very clear that you have had obviously all relative losers, but losers have a role in politics, and that this has led to less support for free trade. Obviously, also I think there is a trend among trade nerds, including myself, lawyers, economists, to have ignored too much what comes from more internationalist circles, but has to do with calling for better environmental regulation. Probably we need a rethink on precisely issues like PPMs. How do we allow for less, how do we support the fact that there should be less carbon emissions embedded in any product in a world of global supply chains? How do you do this in a cooperative way, in a way that still supports developing countries and benefits this? And I think we haven't yet given enough thought to that. That would help probably win over sort of more people in the center of the political ground on that.
Yeah, this statement would bring me.
But no quick. I think there's no quick win to that, apart from telling politicians don't be so short-term. Explain to your people that you're not going to lose.
I would absolutely agree on this. But your last point on this climate-related issues brings me to one more question to the WTO and Europe in the international world. And then I would have one more on industrial policy and the single market. So the last question for now on WTO is again from Manfred Schicklin from the ministry. He wants to bring some more positive vibes somehow, so to try a more positive approach. There are those that argue that the WTO might have a new future as the global hub for the coordination of trade and investment related climate measures, a kind of global climate club. Is that more than just wishful thinking in your point of view?
What I see emerging at the moment is less in the WTO, more in the OECD.
Okay.
That's what is, I think, de facto potentially happening, sadly, for the WTO, which should be more involved. I mean, there's a lot of conversations between the WTO Secretariat, the DG, who's very, very committed to this, but the WTO's members are so busy with all the others and getting just fish deal over the line that it's very difficult. Sure, we should not forget that the WTO is a member-driven organization, which means it's actually stifled by big members who don't want to.
Absolutely, but in order to effectively address this negative externality thing that is related to CO2 emissions and other emissions, the larger the club, the better it would be, obviously. So if we could agree on a broader scale than OECD or the G20, that would be great for sure. But that's interesting that OECD, in your point of view, is doing a lot and good in this term. So maybe we could hope for spillovers from OECD to WTO.
And one would need to watch also the bilateral discussion between the US and the EU on green steel trade, negotiations that have not yet led to a result, and there was a deadline to resolve them by the end of October to allow for the removal of the US Section 232 tariffs, etc. Well, they didn't meet the deadline, etc. But what I hear from Commission officials that there's actually been a lot of progress actually on the substance already, on how to do, on accounting standards for embedded CO2 in products and things like that. So if the EU and the US manage to find some common standards on agreeing, okay, this is a good way of measuring CO, that could be extended via the OECD, maybe to other areas. Who knows? Maybe in the WTO, but not in the short term. That's if we want hope. Maybe that. Let's just hope that we don't have the wrong candidate winning next year.
So there's still some hope for the external relationship.
Until November 2020.
Just for the last 5 minutes, briefly moving to our internal issues. And you already mentioned two, which I found very interesting, the Schengen topic, of course, which again, where Austria has a kind of specific position, I would argue. And of course, you're also right in saying the import ban versus Ukraine from some countries. And Bernard Dax from the Austrian Institute of Technology brings another point about working of the single market, which is now this growing industrial policy and the debate about how much industrial policy And he says, I think it's important to consider that industrial policy in the EU differs from the US in one important feature. The EU has no money, so no central money, like Biden is spending a lot of money from the central government. So the main funding mechanism of the CHIPS Act or the Green Deal industrial plan and all the others basically is to allow member states to provide subsidies. And then the question would be, do you see that this is a potential threat to the single market?
Absolutely. It already is.
Yeah.
It
And so how should we react on this?
I mean, it's benefiting the big member states above all, who get all the factories. I mean, it's already happening. And it's what I find also quite deplorable, to be honest. But it's a trend that's been there, but I find under the von der Leyen Commission, I'm going to get very specific here, has been so deferent to the big member states. I mean, where there is a losing of sight of the role of the Commission as being the guardian of the treaties. I mean, there's so much pressure on the Commission as well, but we have the way we nominate commission president is a problem. So this lady is incentivized to listen to the Germans on the one hand, the French on the other, because of the way she was nominated. So there are many governance issues that go beyond trade, and I don't want to get political here, but I think we have real issues with sort of the what makes the EU sort of this rule of law based polity or body that secures a level playing field for all, and that benefits also the smaller ones. And I do think this is a real challenge. I agree, but then it's about how do we need to get into
and maybe
which is it's beyond our, I mean, it's beyond our pay grade, or what I mean.
Sure,
but it's really important.
Definitely. but so we have 2 more minutes to go, and so I think this would be my last question, which fits into that also. I think due to the fact that we have European elections next year, so wouldn't it be time, in your point of view, to discuss on a European level on how to change European systems? Don't you believe that we would need reforms in this regard? So if I would take Bernard's argument, then he would basically say, well, we need more money at the central level and then allocate it like the US is spending it. I'm not sure whether this is the way to go. I'm also not sure on how well subsidies will be helpful in any case, but this is a different question. But the question would be, aren't we just now too many countries with heterogeneous preferences and different topics, that we are always very slow and always in the mixture of what is European Union as such doing and what are the member states doing, that we cannot compete in terms of speed and scale with the US and China?
I think I would not necessarily agree with you that we can't always be quick and effective. I mean, I find the initial data from the Chinese companies astonishing, that they already feel the heat. I was not expecting it, actually. So there is a form of less easily identifiable ways of working that works. Has EU, I mean, so I'm not sure on the speed question. On the subsidies question, maybe, especially for the green transition and things like that. Might it be better to have more own means and everything? But given my background, I would tend to think in these times that we're in right now, where we have really hard geopolitics, it's more our capacity to act as a foreign affairs player. So I think QMV in foreign policy for me would be absolutely essential to bring more coherence between the external and the internal policy. I think that would be fundamental, and I think it would really help out. It would actually really help the trade policy. It would make things such as foreign direct investment screening much more effective, much more clear to see. Also better to control from Brussels. Is this just protectionism, or are we really dealing here with security measure. And we know that everyone is on board, everyone is practicing it, and everyone is following the same standards. So it would really help, instead of having these messy arrangements where there's a national prerogative and a bit of trade policy, but it's not very effective.
Yeah,
I would think that would be the coherence. And again, you get accused of being federalized, but I'm looking for it as a sort of more efficiency point of view, and also actually in the interest of the smaller member states, because in the end, in the systems we have, in the end, it's the default preference of Berlin come France that prevails. That's my observations over the years.
I think this is a very great concluding statement on what we could improve on. So, Iana, thanks you a lot. Before closing this, I need to apologize to Bernhard because I wrongly interpreted his statement on the funding side in my personal point of view, because he wrote not necessarily about giving more money to the European Union or something like that. So I apologize, Bernhard, for this, to be fully transparent on that. Thanks you so much, Iana, for this discussion and your presentation. I really enjoyed listening to you and talking to you. Thanks everybody for tuning in and for joining this FIW Trade Talk. I hope we see you soon next year for the next series of FIW Trade Talks. And with this, I would like to conclude today's session. Iana, thank you again once more. This was excellent. Bye, and thanks
everybody. Thank you very much for having me. It was an honor. It was a pleasure. And also, next time I pass by Vienna and say hi.
That would be awesome. You're always invited. Definitely. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Stay in